Hi, I'm Mark Unger, producer of Roundtable. Because we find this presentation so special, we really would like for you to see this. Please watch.
Hello and welcome to Single Shot at Manhattan Neighborhood Networks Roundtable. Today we're here to discuss time passage in connection with photography, and in order to discuss it we invited a brilliant long exposure photographer, Laney Barber Jr. Hello Laney, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very
in
much.
Photography, as probably a lot of you know and some probably don't realize, we don't really see what really happened, at least at one particular point. When we're looking at the picture, if it wasn't photographed at a specific shutter speed, we either see some things that was happening which you wouldn't be able to see with the naked eye, or we see more than what our eye would catch in one frame of what we seeing. Let's start with your cloud pictures, because they was always the most fascinating for me. First of all, a lot of people, even if they photograph long exposure, they don't do it during the broad daylight, simply because if you don't take specific technical approach to it, it doesn't allow you to do it, it will just be overexposed. So let's start with technique.
Yeah, so when I first got a camera and started eventually doing long exposures, one of my first thoughts were I want to do them during the daytime. And I tried one, and that's exactly what happened. It just, you open the shutter for a long time, and it's during the daylight, too much light, you just get a white frame. So
Exactly, yeah.
I eventually learned to grab a filter, and neutral density is what I use, and to go out. And what I find is it still takes very specific circumstances to get the type of photos I want.
Naturally.
I have to look outside every day, and if it's a blue sky, I'm not going to take my camera out to get that long exposure, because you won't see any residue of an actual long exposure. I need to make sure that not only is there blue sky, but there are clouds that are moving, and there aren't too many. They're just enough to leave traces of the sky behind that would create the trails over time.
Yes, and looking at it from a more philosophical point of view, what was your original reason to look at the long exposures? Was it aesthetical, or you was looking specifically at capturing this time passage in a way?
Yeah, so definitely capturing the time passage. I feel like if I take an object that isn't moving, like a statue, which I started shooting, and I get those clouds passing, or that if I get that stamp that shows the time is passing, it accentuates how still that object I'm shooting is.
Yeah,
you know,
basically gets the timeless properties. Yes, indeed.
Right.
And what about the actual live objects? They basically mostly they removed, but if it's something slow moving like the clouds, they just becoming to be their own shadow. They basically becoming to be a vector of what's happening with them.
yes.
So it actually is in a way a visible physical time passage depiction.
Yes, definitely. Like what's cool is that you've got those clouds as a sort of remnants of the time passing, but everything that goes quicker kind of disappears. I have one I took in Times Square, and there's tons of people there, but all you see is really the clouds moving and some of the ads, but the people are gone because they're going through so quickly.
No, that actually will take mighty longer exposure.
Yeah.
So what is the longest exposure you ever did?
I mean, generally, I don't go too far beyond a few minutes. I feel like the longest one that I've actually liked the results, and it probably been about 4 or 5 minutes. But I mean, generally, if the items that I want to capture. They're moving quickly. Like, I mean, when we're talking about clouds, sometimes they move very quickly, so it only takes a minute and a half. I feel like the average is about 90 seconds. Yeah, like 90 seconds to maybe like 120 seconds. I can get a lot of movement with those things.
Well, that's actually probably exactly the point where, on one hand, you have only still objects to be focused, but you still have the traces, the remains of the movement around them.
Yes.
Because if you're going any further, you photograph in the same time square, you would just have the buildings and that's it.
Yes.
Everything else will be gone. Well, it's actually one of the most fascinating techniques when it comes to modifying the photograph. As I mentioned to you before we started, it's actually the oldest technique of modifying reality with photography. The very first photograph that was taken actually was the example of the long exposure with just one living object staying very still.
Yes.
Being visible. That's the very first human being photographed is because of the long exposure. The rest of the streets have nothing in them. It was so long that even the traces of the moving objects wouldn't be preserved. So as the longest one, it does have a huge history in photography, and it definitely acquired the new life with digital technology. A lot of things can be reproduced in Photoshop, and we was talking about you actually focusing on out of the camera kind of look. Again, there are two types of photographers.
Yes.
Some treating what comes out of their camera as a final product, some treats it as just ingredients for their final recipe.
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, I definitely feel like I don't want to add too many ingredients after it comes out of the camera. I try to get as much right in there. But, you know, every once in a while, like, there are difficult situations where you might have to adjust the shadow or do something very slight.
Well, slight adjustments. It's basically even Magnum for photography never objected to that. Basically, the rule of thumb for traditional approach to photography, whatever could be done in the Lightroom, can be done digitally as well. For me, it's a questionable approach, but that's what a lot of people believe. And as I understand, I was actually exposed to that physical Lightroom long before I started photographing. You know, the first Laney Brown, who is photographing, right?
Yes.
So can you tell me a little bit more about it? You actually was interfacing with photography long before you started to photograph yourself.
Yes, so my father was a photographer. He did weddings in schools. I grew up in a dark room in my house, and I didn't know as a kid that I would grow up liking photography. I always thought the dark room was scary because you're a kid and you're like, what, you know, it's like dark in there. It's kind of weird, you know, dad hangs out in there or whatever. But it's, yeah, so he did weddings, he did schools. Eventually, when digital first came out, and it was about my college years, I got a digital camera, one of the early models. It was about 2 megapixels, and I started to photograph things that I liked growing up, just street scenes and buildings. I really liked watching skyscrapers go up. You know, Philly in '82, when I was early '80s when I was a kid. They start building skyscrapers. There was a boom of skyscrapers for the first time in decades. And I remember as a kid being excited about that. And they kind of stopped. But one of the first things I did when I got that, you know, when I got my first digital camera, is take pictures of more mundane things that I hadn't been taking pictures of, you know, growing up. The only time I used a camera is when I went on vacation. I got, like, you know, one of those instant disposable ones, and, you know, got the memories with friends. But like something like taking a picture of just a building or something like that was not really something I saw a lot of people around me doing. So that was something I did because I had digital, and I was able to just take pictures of whatever, and then it turned out being the things I liked.
And you also mentioned that he was doing at the same time street photography as well, right?
Yes, like I was just going around like taking street scenes, and you know, like this is the beginning of it, so I didn't even know what I was getting out of it. I just thought, oh, there's something happening here. Let's take a picture of, like, you know, this happening at a street fair or blah blah, you know. And it's just like little things I thought were just irreverent events, and I realized later, oh, there's an art to this. Other people are doing this. Other people have been doing this.
Yeah, so
I just didn't know about it.
Basically, you invented it for yourself without. That's fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, like I thought, you know, that all photography was, you know, like proms, schools, weddings, and things that my dad had been doing, and I've been exposed to, but I didn't realize, you know, the other side of like that art side to it. It's been around for. As
you mentioned, he also was doing some street photography, which you didn't realize he did.
Yeah, well, I looked through an old album when I was young. From when I was young, from one of our early trips to New York, and you know, I saw a bunch of pictures of people in costumes skating in Central Park, and just, you know, people like playing basketball and other things that were just going on in the streets of New York that my dad had taken a long time ago. I remember one street scene of fish being sold on Canal Street, which is, you know, a very classic New York scene, and I saw that and I thought, wow, like, you know, these 30 photographs that, you know, of all the photographs I've seen my dad do growing up, those are my 30 favorite photographs he's ever taken, just because they were New York and they were street scenes, and so like I thought, okay, this is awesome, and this is the type of stuff that, you know, I eventually ended up doing here, you know, when I moved to New York.
Well, I'll actually get back to this after this brief break. And as I understood, you continued and expanded on street photography here in New York, right?
Yes, yes.
Hello, Alex AG from Single Shot is here with yet another single trick. Today I want to tell you about front aperture. Everybody for some reason believes that aperture have to be in the middle of the lens, and I did so also. But at one point I've seen on eBay lenses that was actually made with aperture in front of them for conspicuously, and I started to look into it, and indeed you can have a lens that works just like this. Basically have it right in front of it, and it doesn't affect the way photograph is appearing. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but that's actually the truth. But what is useful about it, if you have a piece of paper with shape in it, you can put it in front of the lens, and your highlights will be right in the shape of what this piece of paper is. Single trick, watch us on YouTube.
We're back. So we was talking about you continuing in a way legacy of your dad, capturing street life of New York now.
Yeah, yeah. So I eventually, like I saw his album and I thought, wow, this is good stuff. This is the type of stuff I like, and the type of stuff that I want to do in New York too. And so generally, I'm always out with my camera. Like in the early years of photographing, I always had my camera with me. And I'm always looking for something, whether it's graffiti or anything that I felt personifies New York.
Personifies New York. It's actually
just
a very
like
nice way to put it.
The hustle and bustle, you know, like come here and there's just people everywhere doing everything. There's people selling things or performing on the train. There's people just out in the open. I would find someone shadow boxing or doing things I didn't see, and I'm from Philly, and it's just a little quieter. You don't see it out in your face as much. I mean, Philly definitely, I mean, it's a city, but it's not, I didn't see as much of it like on every block as I do in New York, but that's just everywhere else is a little slower than New York.
I can imagine.
Yeah. So you come here and you just see, like, you look down in one direction and someone's selling something, in the other direction someone's performing and someone's doing this, you know. When you walk through the village or streets of Manhattan, it's pretty crazy. So
it got a little calmer in the last 10 years, but it's still pretty crazy.
Yeah, exactly. No, I'm talking, I'm definitely in a specific zone thinking I moved here in 2003, you know. Like, you know, put context on it. It's just like you just get off the train or you go like every every direction you see some cool characters. So that's what inspired me to always have my camera on me, because I never know what I'm going to run into. And so I got in the habit of just like capturing those moments. And then I started to sort of photograph parades over time, and I've had several press passes over the years to photograph the Pride Parade, the Dance Parade has been pretty good. I photographed the West Indian Day Parade a few times, and you see these people being very festive and celebratory, and you know, it's great to capture those moments.
Well, it's actually fascinating that out of all the spectrum of what you can do photographically, you're interested in something that is the most momentarily, the parades, because they're happening right now, right here, and will not happen again in the same way. And long exposures, which actually focusing your attention on things that are not changing. Because that's essentially what long exposure does. It helps you to focus on something that will be there when everything else is gone.
And that's what I realized when I'm focusing on the picture of a building or a statue or something that isn't happening just for a moment. I want to show that it's not happening for a moment. So I go to the long exposure to show that things are moving around it, but it is a constant in the middle of those things. And so I have a picture of the Triborough Bridge, and you know, you have the streaks of red and white lights that happen when cars are going through the bridge, because that's what a bridge does. There's always, if it's working, there's always going to be cars moving over it. So I don't want just a still photo of it that happens over a second where there might be traffic on that bridge. I want to show that there's constant flow of traffic, because I feel like that's what it represents more.
Well, actually, when it comes to the urban long exposures, it has even heavier philosophical connotation to it, indeed, because it's about activity of us as people on the planet, and that really one of the most direct and vivid ways to depict the specific visible temporality of human as an individual, and probably in a way eternal preservation of human race. I mean, I hope. Because these specific lights, they really makes the human presence on a photograph to be less personified. Even if it's a long exposure which is not completely removing human beings from a picture, if they just becoming to be shadowy and blurry, it still depersonifies them, makes them to be more part of the humanity than a person.
Right, and then when you turn that person into a movement, they kind of represent all the activity as opposed to them specifically.
Which is the most important property of human being.
Right.
The activity, ability to change themselves, ability to change the world around them. And that gets us back to these parades, because this is in a way also a representation of human activity, but in a completely different, concrete way.
Yeah,
very
definitely.
descriptive.
I was going to say it's more specific, I guess.
So between those two, the time actually is depicted in a completely different way, but it's still present in both of them. So I know that choosing between one or another, it's like choosing between two children for a parent. But what do you think has more meaning, more importance for you? Which one probably is more of a hobby, and which one is more of a passion? I don't know. Is there?
All I will say, I mean, I feel like the long exposures, I gravitate toward them. So it takes me so much longer. You know, we talk about some of the long exposures I've done with clouds. Some of those times I might get up and those clouds might be moving. And so I think, oh, I'm going to go to this site and take a picture of this. By the time I get there, the clouds are gone. So some of the pictures, they seem very simple, but they may take days.
Oh, I can imagine.
The one, I have a few I've taken of the atlas that I've displayed on my site and on my social media. Those are taking weeks to get right. I mean, those are probably some of the earliest times I've tried with it, but just getting the clouds to move in a direction that I feel like frames a photo, and just getting everything all to sync at once, it did not come easy, you know? Like, sometimes that sun, it'll come out and it'll overpower certain aspects of the frame. It'll blow out the building, or it just won't light things a certain way, and I think with that specific photo with the Atlas, I got a case where the clouds were moving behind it, but the sun was obstructed just enough to light everything in the foreground evenly, and that was, I mean, I felt like that took a lot of patience and waiting for that right time. Like, so sometimes, yeah.
So you're not just passively accepting what those clouds given to you. You're actually choosing and.
I'm setting up and I'm waiting and I'm shooting over and over, and sometimes like, I don't like this. I'll come back tomorrow. Or I'll come back on my next day off. That next day off might not be a while, you know. Like, so yeah, it's not easy. Sometimes I have to look at what it's giving me, but I also sometimes look at it and I'm thinking I could probably get maybe a better set of clouds next time I come here. So it does take time. It's not like I'm not passively accepting, like you said. I'm like,
absolutely.
I'm thinking about what I could probably get next time, whether I could improve upon a framing if I were to give it another shot later or not. So,
well, again, talking about time, there is always progression in what photographer does. Is there something you have in mind or in making that you're working on? Any new techniques you planning to master? We was briefly mentioning the multiple exposure shots. It also have very specific relationship with time. Instead of capturing the whole longevity, it captures two moments and basically put them together. And sometimes those two moments can be very far from each other in time.
Yeah, that's funny because it's like you're taking two specific moments, so it's not like you're taking that one item and you're exploring it over time. You're taking two specific isolated moments and you're putting them together, or two or more, and actually they could be one of those moments or both of those moments could be a long exposure. There's so much different things you can do with multiple exposures because you're choosing two different photos. And yeah, I have definitely experimented with it, and I want to play more with the idea. It's just funny because, you know, as opposed to when I set up a tripod and do a long exposure, especially digitally, I get that, you know, that answer right away. I look in and say, oh, you know, this is something sometimes obviously, like, I'll set it up and I'll do one and I think, oh, I'll do it again with lesser exposure more, but multiple exposure, you're moving around and then you get the answer later. So you kind of play around with it more.
That actually gets you back to film photography, where you can't really have the result before you have well, the wait time is short.
And the thing is, I've been experimenting with film, and I've been doing multiple exposures more with film because I feel like it's such a different skill.
Welcome to Single Trick by Single Shot. It's a beautiful weather here in New York, perfect for outdoors photography. However, when you photograph in a lighting like this, there is always one problem. Objects on the ground, like myself right now, are much darker than a sky. Most of you would say HDR is a solution. Yes, it is. However, there is a simpler, very old trick, the gradient filters. It's a completely analog way to make your sky to be even in amount of light with your land. Even simple gray one will give you a lot, but besides that, you can use a blue one and make the sky to actually have more blue color in it. You can use sepia and make a day to look closer to the sunset lighting, and even something as crazy as bright mauve color. The trick is to have gradient right in the middle of the lens.
Alright, we're back. So we was talking about making multiple exposures to be more complex than just one long exposure. So
yes, it's just when you do multiple exposure, you pick two shots or maybe a narrative. You take two pictures and you make them in one on the one still. So there's just so much. There's so many ways you can go with that. You can do a long exposure and a shorter one, or you can do just two isolated, very quick images. but there's also time and space in between them. And like, you shoot one here, you might move around and shoot another one somewhere else.
Precisely, yeah.
There's just so many things, and like, you know, and like when I'm taking a digital photo and I get that answer right away, I still don't really have that answer until I moved around and chose that second or third or fourth shot, however many I want to put in one. And, you know, and then so like, yeah, you get that answer later, but you've already put in so much more work, which is great. But it's just one of those things that just adds more possibility to what you can do, which
well,
is
that's
amazing.
actually another thing related to time, which film photography used to have, and in digital photography, except for what you just described, almost don't exist. In film photography, you really had to wait. You took this picture, and you would know what you had at best in the evening when you would develop it,
yes.
and sometimes much longer than that. In digital photography, only in the setup like this, you're getting back to this situation when you actually have to predict, you actually have to have this time passage going on in your head, not just in your camera.
Yes, and I've after years of shooting digital, I mean, I still shoot sometimes. I carry rolls of film with me too. So I do shoot film every now and then to sort of get myself in that process of thinking a little more beforehand. And I have been experimenting with multiple exposures on film for that reason, because I feel like I'm already in a thing where I have to choose. I have to plan out 2 photos to put together. You know, it's like all that planning. I might as well do it on film too, to kind of accentuate that whole, you know, because film teaches you to like think very hard about what your plan is before you hit a shutter. I learned kind of the opposite direction, where I could hit a shutter and then look, and then hit a shutter and then look.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Well,
it's fun.
Definitely multiple exposures, the long exposure have a very interesting place in the future of photography, and definitely in the future of your photography.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm very happy like playing with those. And
I'm actually looking forward to see those more complicated versions of this process in the way you're creating them.
yeah, definitely.
I really want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
It was really a great show, and I really enjoyed this conversation. So let's hope we will find more time to discuss it further, especially when you would come up with some of those complex ones.
Thank you, sir.
Keep us posted. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex.
I hope you found that worth watching as much as I did. I'm Mark Unger for Roundtable. Thanks for watching.